It's Mr. Sinti, and thanks for joining me today for this discussion on the limbic system of the brain. That's right, the limbic system has everything to do with emotion. It's the emotional area of the brain. Now, needless to say, that's pretty crucial because our brain, although we like to think of our brain as a thoughtful, contemplative, decision making, sort of cerebral cortex kind of logical contemplation. A lot of what we need to do is react in the moment, and emotion is part of that. In other words, if we're in a fearful situation, we need to get out of it. And so I want to point out something right out of the gate on this. You'll notice that there's in this limbic system, there's no particular region, there's no anatomical area of the brain that is going to be called the limbic structure, but rather it's a system. It's the only portion of the brain that's referred to as a system because what it involves is a collection of various structures, nuclei, or regions of the brain that interact to relate to these emotions. And so hopefully this is intriguing, perhaps somewhat vague, but that's the point of the video. And so when someone speaks aloud about the limbic system, it sort of sounds as I was saying before, like a single structure, but that's simply not the case. It's really a collection of structures that work together collaboratively. And basically, it's located on sort of both sides of the thalamus. And again, there's more images that are going to be coming on this. And it's below the cerebrum. But the truth be told, part of the cerebral cortex is part of this as well. I should point out that it's not well understood. And when I say it's not well understood, it's not just me. It's a lot of neuroscientists have been learning and have been experimenting and doing all kinds of research in this area for many decades. And I find it almost more interesting when less is known. It kind of stimulates more curiosity, if you will. So I hope it does for you as well. Again, that's the point of the video, is to not to explain everything, but rather to incite more questions about the topic. And so in those early days of brain science, it was thought that these structures were really, really related to smell. And I will say that, a lot of that came from research done working with rats. Now, if you were to take a look at a rat brain, the olfactory area, in other words, the smell is huge in the brain of a rat because it gets a lot of sensory input from smell, and therefore its emotions are linked to that. And so we thought that that this was, the origin, the rhinencephalon, a rat brain, was a really important part of the lymphatic system. But as it turns out, the lymphatic system is more about depending on the organism. Like we rely a little bit on smell, olfactory, but we have vision, and other organisms rely on hearing. And so all of that sensory input comes in, and then we deal with it emotionally. In other words, if we hear something, or we hear bird songs and we're stimulated to want to respond to them, or we hear something scary, and so, or we see something, and so there's a lot of really cool comparative anatomy having to do with behavior in terms of evolutionary significance of the system that we're talking about, the limbic system. And so there's debate about the number of structures that are involved, and there's one could argue, if you really know what you're talking about, that many, if not all, structures of the brain are part of this emotional response and limbic system. But I'm just going to break it down because there's unanimous agreement that there's three most important structures, although, of course, if you know me, I'm going to bring up a couple more. But it's the amygdala, which are two little tiny structures that reminded early anatomists of the structure of an almond, and that's where it gets its name. The hippocampus, which is a really cool structure, and cingulate gyrus. And so that particular area is actually literally part of the cerebellum. And so more to come about these structures. And so functionally, just to give you a flyover understanding of, what is the limbic system doing, it's basically having everything to do with emotional states. It establishes these emotional states that we have. In other words, fear or anger or happiness, these kinds of things. And obviously it links to conscious functions of the cerebral cortex. In other words, decision making about that. And so when we face a particular emotion, we need to decide what we want to do with it. And then there's autonomic kind of responses as well. And so this limbic system, when it takes in emotion in fear, like for example, if it hears something scary, then that might trigger a response in hormones, and that will link with an endocrine response. And ultimately, it will involve perhaps movement, and that'll involve sending nerve impulses down the brainstem, motor neurons, and affect an action. And so it's really cross communication. Communication is the theme here, that the limbic system is sort of this emotional hub of all different kinds of structures, but it's all about communicating and getting things done. And then if that wasn't enough, it facilitates the limbic system storage of memory. In other words, where new memories are formed. And that's important too, because, if you think about it evolutionarily speaking, learning is an important part of survival, and especially things that cause emotional distress. In other words, it behooves us to remember things that put ourselves in fatal danger. And so memory has got to be part of this process of emotion. And so there's going to be areas, as I alluded to before with this cingulate gyrus, there's particular lobes of the cerebral hemisphere that are particularly important in this. The hippocampus, and again, there's a para, meaning to the side, hippocampal gyrus, that's important as well. So these are part of the cerebral hemisphere. I just wanted to point that out. So just to back it off just for a second, a gyrus, if you're unfamiliar with that, is this convolution or fold that we have in the brain. And those folds, when you think of the classic picture of the brain, all of those folds help to increase the surface area. And that, of course, or maybe not of course, but that increases the number of neurons that can be present in that area. And gray matter, when we talk about gray matter, what we're talking about is clusters of nuclei or soma, if you will, of the neuron itself. And those tend to be gray in coloration, as opposed to white matter, which is more of the cords or axons that are coming out of it. And so there's many gyra that interact in the limbic system in the brain as a whole. Just want to point that out. So these two structures are really cool. They sort of arc around like this. They're highlighted in blue. Cingulate gyrus right in here. And so what are those up to? So again, this is a superficial coverage of what these structures are doing. But if you've ever been so excited that your arms are flailing in the air, and you're so angry that you're clenching your fists and clenching them, this portion of the brain is responsible for this. So it plays, let me go back to that, plays a role in expressing emotion through gesture. Okay. And so this is complicated, though. I just wanted to point out that, in terms of this, the cerebral cortex on the very top, right in here, there's a separation here, which is known as the central gyrus, and anything to the front of this, and this is in the back, this is the front of the brain, so this is anterior. So at the very posterior part of the frontal lobe is this motor cortex, which is responsible for decision making, for motion, and then at the very anterior part of the parietal lobe is this somatosensory area. And so this is where we perceive and decide on skeletal motion. This is where we sense or perceive sensory information. And so this is also, there's connections here as well. And so this is responsible for, in terms of the motor area and sensory area are part of recognizing what part of the brain is being stimulated, and decisions need to be made accordingly. And so this is related to receiving emotional input. Okay, and so below the thalamus, okay, one might be able to have thought about that. Hypo meaning below something. So below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus, small, it's about the size of a kidney bean, but powerful. It is involved in this because when there's a situation where the body's in danger, for example, though the hypothalamus works autonomically in the autonomic nervous system, it's able to produce hormones that cause pituitary gland to secrete hormones that will cause other organs in the body to secrete. For example, if there's a stressful situation, the hypothalamus might get the pituitary gland to start releasing hormones that will stimulate the production of adrenaline or the production of cortisol. So cortisol releasing hormone, for example, does that, because then it causes the pituitary gland to secrete adrenocorticotropin hormone. In other words, causing the adrenal gland to produce cortisol, which is then going to increase energy production. And so this is famously known as fight or flight. Likewise, in terms of controlling autonomically, in other words, not consciously, sort of a suppressive kind of situation. In other words, a calming. It's a rest and digest. So it's able to inhibit and incite endocrine glands, which then produce hormones which cause response to emotion. So that's part of it too. So this hippocampus, as you can see here highlighted in blue, is involved in memory processing. And as I alluded to this before, I find this to be particularly interesting because, again, emotion, whether it be seeing something or remembering something that caused an emotional response, is useful. And so it makes logical sense that the hippocampus, this region right here, and there's two of them, are involved in memory is very logical. And so the word hippocampus, just for a moment, is kind of an interesting thing. If you look up at Greek mythology, you'll find that hippocamp, which hippo kind of from Greek meaning horse, but also part of it being like the tail end, sort of like a centaur a little bit, or a chimera, like a combination of a hybrid organism, is part of an eel or a fish, a horse and a fish. But actually,